Okay, everybody, it's Kevin Lockett once again. Today, because usually while I'm interviewing people, they're in New York, Los Angeles. But guess what? We're both in Akron today.
That's right. That's right.
I'm the only person that's excited to be in Akron, so I'll take that.
Best location in the nation.
It is the best location in the nation. I probably should have moved a long time ago. I had that youthful energy. I was like, I'm staying because we could build things in Akron and Cleveland, and even though I'm still here, there's that little Kevin Lockett in the past that said, you should have gone to LA. It's like, yes, I know. But with technology, I can build my own LA here. So how are you today, sir?
I'm doing great.
Before we begin, because today we're talking to David about his book that he co-authored, The Beginning Was the End. It is a book about Devo, who are from Akron, Ohio. He did that with Jay Dellinger. Before we get into that, one of the things we should talk about David. David is a professor at the University of Akron. He was a former writer for the Akron Beacon Journal. That's when I first got to know David, reading his stuff. He's written six books featuring the Esquire and Vanity Fair. But the thing that I'm most impressed by, which I did not know, you wrote for Beavis and Butt-Head.
That's right. If you want to feel old, one of my students recently said, I saw that you wrote for a TV show. I had to look it up. You didn't know what Beavis and Butt-Head. I did. I wrote briefly for I wrote for the show for most of the time it was on the air, but I was a small player in that.
How did that even happen?
Like many things in those industries, almost completely by accident. I was a columnist at the Medina County Gazette. It was my first professional job. And I had written, the show had just come on the air. It was kind of underground. And I had written about it. And long and short is Mike Judge, the creator of the show, got a hold of one of the columns and thought it was a little funny. And the show had just started to suddenly get attention. And so MTV wanted a whole bunch of episodes very quickly. So he was like, actively looking for writers. So it was just kind of like in the right place at the right time. And it was fun. I was the only person who worked on that show who wasn't like in New York or Los Angeles, like desperately trying to make it in an industry that's very, hard to make it in and cutthroat. I was just like, hey, this is fun. I'll do it in my living room in Akron, Ohio, and take it as it comes.
Was there a chance for you to stay on as a writer long term, or was it just that?
I never really pursued it that way. It was kind of like they were open to. I was just I would pitch them a few episodes. They might pick one season. I think I had one. Most seasons I had one episode or so, and a little bit of other work.
And one more thing. So Mike Judge, like, he had battles with MTV, and that's why he ended up doing King of the Hill, because of residuals and things like that. Do you get any residuals from those episodes at all?
I've gotten a few very, very small checks. Yeah.
Thank you, MTV. Okay, so we're flash forward to 2023. Well, you wrote the book in 2023. It's 2024. You wrote a book about Devo back in You and Jade wrote a book about Devo. We Are Not Men, We Are Devo, back in 2003 or 2004. 2003 or 2004.
2003 came out.
2003, and that book was great. But then it went out of print. So before we get into the new book, explain to me how books like that go out of print. And does the publisher tell you when a book goes out of print, or it just disappear?
In that case, it just faded. The publisher was sort of in the midst of going out of business, and that book came out. It was the first full biography of Devo, and so there was a need for it. But yeah, it was only in print for a few years, and then the publisher again went out of business. So it had been out of print for, I would say, at least 15 years before we really decided we wanted to take strides to get it back into print and to kind of reimagine it, which is what this book became.
So what's the process of that? Like, did you have to go to court, or is like there's like a bankruptcy? Like, how do you get to get? I mean, you wrote it, but the publishing company might own it. Like, how do you get to?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
every contract is different, but in our case, the contract stated that if the book went out of print and it was out of print for a certain amount of time, and we had made our due diligence to get it back into print, and it had not happened, that the rights for the material would come back to us, and that became the case. And so we knew, Jade and I have been, in touch and good friends ever since we worked on the original project. And so we knew for a long time that we wanted to find a way to do this. And then we finally, just found the right fit. So
you took the original book and you basically remixed it. So it has a lot of the guts of the original, but how is this different from the previous book?
yeah, so Jade and I, again, I work at the University of Akron, and the University of Akron Press has a really good series in Ohio culture and history. And so we recognized that that would be a good fit for the book. And we approached the director, John Miller, and he was all over the idea of not only bringing it back into print, but we're like, we had a really good session where we were like, what can we do to make this book special and relevant now? And a couple of things were happening. 2023 was the 50th anniversary of Devo's first public performance on the Kent State campus while they were still students and just finding their way. Enough time had passed, and there have been some documentaries and some other stories of Devo that have come out in the time since our book. And one thing we recognized as a weakness of the original book is when we put it together, the best part of their story really is the decade of their formation and their finding themselves as artists before their national emergence as a pop band. And so the original book, most of the book is of that period, and everything from Whip It, when they have their first and real big hit, on forward only takes up like the last 30 pages of that book, because it's more kind of by the numbers, behind the music kind of standard rock music story, tension with the record label, internal tensions with the bands, eventually decline. So we said, here's an opportunity to take the best part of that story and craft it in a book that's truly about the Ohio years, about Devo's genesis in Ohio, about, again, the nearly 10 years that they spent developing their idea and their concept and their musical project. And also there's a narrative, I won't give away the spoiler, but there's a narrative within that, this kind of a dramatic narrative of a push and pull conflict going on among the original group of people that sort of ends at the end of that time, that really made this narratively a strong story. Plus the fact that if we were to make a more concise story, there would be room for more visuals. And my co-author, Jay Dellinger, is an art curator and an amazing collector. He's got a whole bunch of stuff in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He collects visual art, but he also collects rock and roll memorabilia and artifacts. And he's got this unbelievable collection of Devo stuff. That's his main focus, is the punk and new wave era, but specifically Devo and the Ramones. He has special affinity for those collections. So he had photographs, most of which were taken by an Akron photographer named Bobby Watson, who was an early friend and longtime friend of the band, and just was always taking pictures. She worked for the Akron Public Library for a long time. She's still around. She's recently retired. So Jade had acquired much of her archives. So we had all this visual material that we didn't have room for in the original book, that the University of Akron Press was eager to make room for, so we could make a much more visual book with a more concise, more compelling story, I think. And so that was the plan, and that's, I hope, what we came up with.
The Devo documentary came out on Sundance. debuted at Sundance. Were you part of that in any way, or did they come to you asking for information, or that was like something completely separate?
Yeah, it was a totally separate project. I've heard great things about it. I'm eager to see it. I hear that it's in the works to have an Akron debut sometime this year. So looking forward to seeing it. So, but no, that was a separate project. There was another documentary project that was in a long sort of process of formation that Jade and I were kind of interviewed and consulted on, but that one kind of faded away as this other one started to take off.
Devo is fascinating to me because I thought I kind of knew this story, but I realized I really didn't. Because when Whip It came out, I was in junior high school. So it was like you saw the red cone hats and all that stuff. It was the MTV, which was great. But when I was doing research, I realized that was great. But the real story, well, there's a lot of different stories that I like. The real story was 77 and 78. They were almost at their peak powers.
Yeah.
Because especially when David Bowie says you're the future of music.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That is an amazing thing. And you're from Akron, Ohio, and Bowie, of all people, saying these guys are the future. Tell me about that 77, 78 period with them.
So the reason that moment is so fascinating is it does go back all the way to the beginning, because they meet initially, as like art students, burgeoning musicians, but they have this whole broad concept of de-evolution, and they're doing writing manifestos and poems about the notion that humans are evolving in reverse. They're making visual art, they're doing performance art, and the musical part, the band part, was only part of it. Sometimes people meet in college and they make a band and they're like, we want to make it in the music business, we want to go on tour. And with them, it was more like we want to alienate audiences and be as abrasive as possible. And it's really, for a number of years where they're experimenting, and because it's Ohio and nobody's really, paying attention or putting pressure on them to make it, they're able to just find themselves artistically. And so it's not until 1976 that they add the final piece of this unit of musicians that's been kind of people coming in and out, but they add drummer Alan Myers, who takes them from this experimental, quirky, kind of mechanical sounding band and gives them this backbone. He was a really sophisticated technical drummer, but also just a lock solid timekeeper and rock and roll drummer, and gives them that punch that so much of them happened by accident. And part of the accident is it's right at the moment that punk rock is just becoming like recognized and developing an audience. And they were punk partly by accident, partly by circumstance, which we'll probably talk about a little bit in terms of their politics and their experiences, and partly by musical influence. And so 76, that happens, and right away they're starting to make more professional recordings, starting to send out demos, and now finally, their biological clocks are ticking, and they're doing that. We'd like to make it in the music, so they're sending demos out, trying to get noticed, and they get the attention of the New York, sort of underground rock scene, and they get a couple club dates in New York, and the buzz just starts happening. Yeah, and that's when Bowie gets interested in them. Brian Eno gets interested in them. Iggy Pop, very influential people of that moment, and they clicked, and that's kind of where the trajectory takes its really sharp turn.
You mentioned the sound. I was reading, I don't know if you wrote it or I saw it in The Guardian, and they were talking about how their sound was like industrial and electronic, and it kind of reminds me of what kids don't have today. Like Johnny Cash, I think Little Richard said too, how they were inspired by the sounds of the trains going by. Devo, you had the rubber plants here. Even when Trent Reznor with Nine Inch Nails, like you still had factories still going. So I'm sure that influenced him in some things. So the sound of Devo is very important, because I don't think kids today, because everything's so sanitized now, because everything is businesses, kids are not inspired by the sounds and the machines that's around them.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy, the Johnny Cash train thing, because I think you're right on the money. They, it wasn't like they looked around and they said, like, oh, these factories around here, we should, use that sound. It was more like you say, like it just was in their atmosphere, and so, but also, especially then when there wasn't the access to cultural information, you used what was around, you just picked up the stuff. And so, yeah, so they drew heavily on the look of industry, the yellow Tyvek jumpsuits that they wore, that was their iconic first look, that was their stage costumes. Those came from an industrial supply house that supplied the janitorial supplies for the rubber companies, the to keep the poison out, you know, and so they wore that, and yeah, they took sounds. Their the first drummer was Jim Mothersbaugh, a third brother of Mark Mothersbaugh and Bob Mothersbaugh, and he made this homemade electronic drum kit, which he went to a muffler shop and he had the muffler guys weld together this unwieldy metal frame and attached guitar pickups to it. And he would hit it with metal objects and make these mechanical sounds. And it's unlistenable. It just sounded like it was grating and atonal but interesting. And it sounded like a factory. It sounded like machines and working. And so that's what that's what they were trying out. And they also, when they made their first film, and film is really where they gained their first attention, it was for their films rather than their recordings. They went to Goodyear, and Goodyear's headquarters had the World of Rubber Museum. I don't know if you ever got to see it, but it's this really cheesy, museum, and sort of interactive experience with rubber, but really low rent. It had like dioramas of a Liberian rubber tree plantation, like not recognizing the irony that it was practically slave labor that they were using to harvest the raw materials. And it had like one of Mario Andretti's race cars with Goodyear tires on it. And so they went to Goodyear and they said, they sort of lied, and they said, we're film students at the University of Akron. We're making a movie. Can we film in here? And they're like, yeah, sure. And so they come with all their weird costumes, and they start, running around the place, making film. So all of the industry stuff around them was really interesting to them as artists. They were seeing it with a different set of eyes. And so, yeah, so they became, when you use the term industrial, I think you think of like the Chicago scene of the 80s with Ministry and some of the other bands that were more based in really like sort of heavy, kind of a hybrid of heavy metal and art rock. And Devo was more like literally industrial, in the sense that they were taking the aesthetics of industry, including like the work ethics of industry, and applying it ironically or sonically to what they were doing.
You mentioned the film part. Now today, a kid, let's say you have a young Devo, they can just grab their iPhones and get software online if they want to, and just make their own films. These guys made films back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Film was not cheap.
Yeah.
Editing took a long time. Like, was a discussion in the book, like how did they actually were able to afford, or how they were able to do this? Because it's not today is easy. I could do this on my Chromebook, right? I could edit on my Chromebook. This was not. These are prehistoric times that they had, and they made a bunch of short films, or just films or concert films. Talk about that for a second, about film and Devo.
So from the very beginning, they were very visually oriented. They were visual arts majors, some of them. And they just had a strong sense of visual art. And when Jerry Casale, who was really he and Bob Lewis, who was not a member by the time they were really kind of starting to make it, but is a major part of the story in our book. They were the two sort of originators of the Devo concept. And Jerry Casale was taking art classes, and he befriended this guy named Chuck Statler, who was studying film at Kent State. And Chuck and Jerry really like traded a lot of ideas about cinema and the art of filmmaking and the history of film and so forth. And then Chuck goes on to Minneapolis, and he's making his living in the film industry as well as he can, doing commercials and that kind of work. But it had remained in contact. And here's where, so many times their story should have ended or imploded or whatever. And this is like mid 1970s, I think 75 or 76. And Devo was starting to think that, it's just not going to happen. And we got to become grown-ups. They're getting well into their 20s. We're going to have to quit pursuing this and maybe think about what our day jobs are going to be or whatever. And Chuck happens to come home for the holidays, and he and Jerry go out for drinks, and Chuck says, well, if you guys are just going to throw in the towel, we need to document this. And he's like, I have access to my company's equipment, which I could sort of, kidnap for a weekend or whatever and bring it to Akron, and we should do something. And so they did. So they wrote up a storyboard, and they were going to record a couple of their songs, but not, the music video didn't exist yet. It was just, we're going to make a film using the music of Devo, but it's going to be this, conceptual art piece visually set to that soundtrack. And so he comes in, and he's got this good equipment. So that's where, they were able to afford to do it, because they were using free labor, all their friends were going to be the actors in this. And so they put together these films, and that was The Truth About De-Evolution, their first film. And so what they started to do is when they performed, they would hang a bed sheet up, against the back wall of the club where they were playing. They'd show the film, which was like less than 15 minutes. So basically the film would be their opening act, and then they'd come on and they'd play their set. Well, Chuck Statler on his own decides, these are pretty good. I'm going to enter it in the Ann Arbor Film Festival. And he does, and it wins prize. And so that's why I said earlier, the first attention they got outside of Northeast Ohio was for the film rather than for the music. And that film was so visually captivating. It still is. I still literally get goosebumps when I watch that. Just the way they had learned how to be robotic in their movements, both performing on stage as musicians, but also in the acting that they did for this. It's just a really fascinating image. And they also they just had this sense of weird, sort of like Dada art weirdness of just absurdity, but a sense of humor that was just, always there. And all of these things just kind of came together, and you see it. And it's this, to me, it's this pure document of, again, this had been forming since like 1968. So this is, and these people are only in their 20s. So this is like a third of their lives, basically. Or so, I can't do math, but, like a significant amount, and certainly their formative years had all been spent thinking about this and developing it. And it all comes out there in that film. And that's really, kind of where they started to
sidebar for a second. This isn't in your book, but I was watching right before we were talking. I was watching a bunch of stuff, and I saw the De-Evolution film, and I was listening to We Are Not Devo. Now, I feel like Coldplay is kind of like more of a smoothed out version of Radiohead. So when I heard that song, I was like, oh, that kind of reminds me of Talking Heads. Do you think Talking Heads were influenced? Because I felt, I was like, this feels like a Talking Heads song. Do you think Talking Heads, even though they were doing their own thing, do you think it's like David Byrne kind of took the idea of Devo and he was more okay with the commercialized version of it, where Devo wasn't cool with the commercialized version? Or am I just kind of doing a strange music theory of it?
I certainly don't know, like, literally if that's the case. And, but I definitely, there's definitely that same sort of jerky nerd, nerd image, jerky movement, kind of awkward, cool thing about them. And, there's definitely crossover. Whether one was influenced by the other or not would not be a question I could answer, but they definitely, it was a new, up until then, the rock and roll was sort of based in the blues, following certain chord patterns that were recognizable, and and this was still in the age, though, where there were still new avenues in rock music that hadn't been discovered yet. And this was, so this was really, I would say, post-punk, in the sense that this was punk rock kind of took the garage rock of the 60s and revved it up and found a new aggression in it that made something new. And this was where it was like, we're going to take that aggression that punk found, but we're going to like do away with the power chords, and we're going to do away with sort of the 1-4-5, bass line pattern that comes from the blues and from soul music. And we're going to make it like intentionally, like we're going to remove the soul from rock and roll, and we're going to replace it with something else. And I think in the case of both the Talking Heads and Devo, they replaced it with a sense of like cold robotics that was also very human. And so if you watch Devo's movements, like another performance I think is iconic is their first Saturday Night Live appearance, and specifically their performance of the song Satisfaction. Because first of all, that song is exactly what I just said. It took the classic rock and roll standard, Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, based on a blues riff, and it turns that riff not only backwards but inside out, so that the drum part for that song is really based. It's basically a backwards reggae rhythm, and if you talk to a drummer about that beat, it seems impossible to play. That's why Alan Meyer's technical skill was so great, and it was actually Bob Casale, the rhythm guitarist, who came up with that dun 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 dun, that weird pattern. That's the same pattern, but it's almost like played in reverse as the Stones song. So it's turning rock and roll inside out. And then if you watch them perform, they're moving almost with this robotic, jerky movements, but there's also something so human about them that's, like, I think it's captured in the final moment. They play the song Saturday Night Live in front of millions of people, and they stop on a dime and they all freeze. And they freeze for like, a long beat. And then one of them just does this bow. And it's almost like this, I think, homage to the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, where the Beatles at the end of the song, these, in the cheeky English way, would all do their bow. And that was the sort of the Beatles thing. And it almost feels like it's like taking that first wave of rock and roll and taking the pieces of it and making something new that was their own. So, and certainly Talking Heads were doing the same thing.
Right. I was watching, you know what? I'm going to skip that question. In 1977, they released their first single. And also in 1977, you have Fleetwood Mac with Rumors. And the reason I put those two together, because diametrically different bands, different sound, different makeup. However, relationships. Fleetwood Mac had a husband and wife, and at that time, Lindsay and Nikki, Stevie Nicks, were dating. Over at Devo, you have two sets of brothers. How were they able to manage that? Because I can love my brother, but I don't love my brother all the time. So how do you manage that? Because it's one thing on Fleetwood Mac's side, I'm dating, I'm married, that's a whole different dynamic. But you have two sets of brothers, and it's not like brothers get along all the time. So how were they able to manage that as a band?
That's another. I had never thought about that. You're right on. I mean, that's the internal dynamics of that band are so interesting. In the same way that, I mean, there's this quadrilangular relationship in both bands where it's two sets of couples, but there's tension going in four directions. And with Devo, so the two front people of Devo are Jerry Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh. Mark comes to the band after they had really sort of taken form. So it's kind of Jerry's band. And he was always the ambitious, more aggressive, more confrontational kind of leader that band needed, because Mark comes in and he's this very arty, shy person, very musical, more musical than anyone who had played in that group so far, but not a natural performer, or the sort of the ambitious kind of cutthroat that you kind of need to have in your mix. And that a big part of Devo's image all throughout is masks. And the very first performance that took place in 1973 is on the Kent State University campus at an arts festival. And Mark Mothersbaugh was so terrified to go on stage that he wore a monkey mask for that first performance. And it was less as a theatrical gesture and more as a protective gesture, because he was so afraid to be on the stage. So you've got these two very different personalities. It's a little bit reductive, but it's kind of a Lennon-McCartney kind of relationship. They both need each other. They're both sort of the front people. Each has a brother. And there's always some semblance of a power struggle in that band, where it seemed like with each of them with a brother, it's like they each had an ally in the band who was not a power player, but a backup. And for a while, as I mentioned before, there were 3 Mothersbaughs in the band when Jim Mothersbaugh was playing. Jim continued to be part of the stage crew after things took off. And eventually he gets eased out by Jerry. And again, I think this is because Jerry felt outnumbered by Mothersbaughs. So that dynamic of tension of the two of the two sets plays into their story most definitely as they move forward.